My name is Natasha Bajema. I'm the director of the Converging Risks Lab at the Council on Strategic Risks. I've spent the last 20 years examining national security risks like nuclear weapons, biological weapons, pandemics, and emerging technologies. Yeah, so my career path was a bit indirect. I did my master's work at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, now known as the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, back in 2000. And when I arrived at the Institute, I didn't really know much about weapons of mass destruction. In fact, I was much more interested in climate change and energy security issues. But many of you might know that there is the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey as well, and it is affiliated with the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And so many students actually go to Monterey to study weapons of mass destruction and that type of issue. And so I was surrounded by students who were thinking about North Korea, ballistic missiles, and if you know anything about Monterey, it's a very small town, and there are only a couple of bars where the students hang out. And every Friday night, many of the Miss students would head down to the Crown and Anchor, just a couple blocks away. And most of the discussions would feature weapons of mass destruction. And so I decided to, instead of going to Washington, D.C. for a summer internship, I would stay in Monterey and I would take on an internship at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies. And that's how I initially got started. And then I started taking classes in it and pretty much got sucked into the vortex. I've always wanted to be a fiction writer, but it's one of those many goals that, I've had, but put aside to do my career. And I think it was in 2016 when I really started to sit down and write fiction. I use fiction as a way to work out the things I'm worried about. I recently kind of uncovered that because I started out writing speculative mystery novels about technology. I wrote a thriller on the risk of nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, which is ever present in my mind, called Rescind Order. And for me, that was kind of an intellectual exercise. It was considering, 10 years from now, so 20 is set in 2033. So 10 years from now, given the advances in technology, what are the new risks for nuclear decision-making and crisis amongst nuclear weapon states? And so I wanted to explore that in my career. And so instead I wrote a fiction novel to kind of think through the scenario kind of from the position of the president and other high-level policymakers. So till that point, all of these novels were kind of to help me work through things I was worried about, but also write cool fiction stories while worrying about them. Then I switched gears. I decided I wanted to try my hand at epic fantasy because that was my favorite genre growing up. So as I've been writing that one, my first novel in fantasy, I realized that it speaks to a different side of my spirit, my hopeful side, the side where I hope that nations come together and solve the problems of today instead of warring against each other and destroying our planet. And I'm finding that that's what I love to do more than worry about the things that I worry about in my daily life. So obviously, I think I'll continue to write in both fantasy and science fiction because they speak to the two sides of my personality, but I think I'm going to lean a lot heavier into epic fantasy. On nuclear issues, I would have to start with the very beginning. And so you're looking at a combination of history, geopolitics, technology, and those types of issues. So you would look at, obviously, the development of nuclear weapons during the Manhattan Project. You'd want to examine the origins of the Cold War and how that transpired between the United States and the Soviet Union. You'd want to teach students about the emergence of deterrence theory, which kind of started as people started thinking about what nuclear weapons meant for international politics, but really solidified in the 1960s. So I think to start teaching about nuclear weapons, you really have to kind of go all the way back into history and look at the very beginnings. In the next phase, I think I would focus on the nuclear nonproliferation regimes, which started to get going in the late 1960s, mid 1960s, late 1960s, with the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and other treaties. Well, there was one that came before it, the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. But yeah, so look at the 1960s and start looking at the formation of the nuclear nonproliferation regimes and the norms against nuclear weapons. So I think that's really the second phase of teaching students about nuclear weapons. And then in the third, I would have to examine the emergence of current threats. So the rise of non-state actors and the potential risk of nuclear terrorism, the end of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and the rise of the multipolar threat of nuclear weapons, the emergence of new nuclear weapons powers. And then finally, I would conclude looking at the future and emerging technologies and how that fundamentally changes everything that came before it. Public should care about nuclear weapons because they exist, and they are the most destructive weapons on the planet. They exist in thousands. So the United States currently has just under 4,000 deployed nuclear weapons. We have 1,500 under the START treaty, but we have many more in reserve. Russia also has about the same numbers, and other countries are building new nuclear weapons as well. So as long as these weapons exist and are pointed at each other, we have to think about the fact that we might lose everything that we hold dear at any given moment, because these weapons are so destructive. And once one is unleashed, it's hard to see a world in which more are not unleashed. So I don't see, unless it's a non-state actor threat, I'm not sure there's a scenario where only one nuclear weapon is detonated. Well, I'm very concerned about emerging technologies and how they fundamentally alter the landscape for nuclear weapons, especially when it comes to decision-making amongst nuclear weapon states. So if you think about the rise of social media and the problem of disinformation, kind of how to untangle what's actually happening out in the world, there are other aspects, for example, some positive, the emergence of commercial satellite imagery, which allows other actors, third parties, to hold nuclear weapon states accountable for their actions and basically to detect any emergent nuclear weapons activities. But then you also have the challenge of autonomous systems and automation that's facilitated by artificial intelligence and what that all could mean for nuclear decision-making down the road. The windows for making a decision to launch a nuclear weapon are already pretty short, about 30 minutes, possibly shorter, depending on where the nuclear weapons might be launched and their targets. And we're looking at a further contraction of that decision-making window. So I'm primarily concerned with policymakers coming up with the idea that we should expand that decision-making window by integrating artificial intelligence into nuclear weapons systems. And I worry about the unintended consequences of that.